Hello again, everybody. Today is the section of our class on truth, and it also marks the first day of the segment on epistemology. So we're going to be ending the class on epistemology, and so one of the fundamental pillars of epistemology is truth. And we're going to see why over the course of this lecture. Let's see here. Okay, so epistemology is a part of philosophy, right? So we could distinguish epistemology from, say, metaphysics, and distinguish metaphysics and epistemology from ethics, right? Which we've been doing earlier, right? And so metaphysics kind of touches a little bit on the philosophy of religion stuff. So in this class, we've covered the three major portions of philosophy, which is metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Okay, um, epistemology is a portion of philosophy that treats the nature of knowledge, the sources of knowledge, and the methods for achieving and evaluating knowledge claims. Okay, good. So, what's all this mean? So, epistemology, in a very broad sense, deals with what is knowledge? How do we know certain things? How do we know things, say, about ethics? How, like, under what conditions can we say that we know something? Like, are our ordinary knowledge claims, do our ordinary knowledge claims meet those criteria, right? And so we can ask, like, do we know things? So for the next couple of days, we're going to be talking about the nature of knowledge. We're going to examine a traditional account of knowledge, which is called the justified true belief account of knowledge. We're going to go into a good deal of depth on that. It should be tomorrow, and so we're going to look at the conditions for knowledge. Trying to understand the nature of knowledge, and then we're going to think about the sources of knowledge, right? So testimony, perception, reason, all of these things are potentially things that give us knowledge, right? And so we can ask questions like, are these good sources? Can we know things on the basis of, say, testimony or perceptual experience, right? Just seeing something, does that warrant me knowing that thing? Um, and then lastly, we'll be looking at the methods for achieving knowledge and evaluating knowledge claims. And so in the next couple of days, we'll be talking about moral encroachment. And moral encroachment is about the relationship between ethics and epistemology. And so some knowledge claims are undermined by ethical claims. And so we can think about how to evaluate knowledge in light of ethics. Anyway, so this is epistemology very broadly. Okay, so you might be wondering, okay, well, so what does truth have to do with all the stuff I've been saying about knowledge? So one of the component features of knowledge is belief, right? So usually, think about it. So when you say that you know something, and then if you say, "Hey, I know this thing," and I were to say, "Well, do you believe that thing?" You would say, "Well, yeah, I believe that the thing is the way that it is, right? Because I know it." So the idea here is that knowledge and belief are somehow connected, right? Okay. So it seems like a component of knowledge has to be that you believe something to begin with. It's hard to see, if you don't believe something, it's hard to see how you can know that thing, right? Okay. I don't know. We may argue about that, but, like, I think that seems intuitive. So there are two senses of belief here. One is belief, we might say, in Plato's sense, which is thinking that a proposition is true. Okay. So this will be our target uh, uh, for the epistemology section, right? So, so what is thinking a proposition is true? First, we've talked about propositions already, right? They tend to be sentences that make some claim about the way that the world is, right? So I could say something like, "It's raining outside," in West Tennessee, right? Whether or not it is actually raining in West Tennessee will determine whether or not that claim is true, right? That proposition is true. So when I say that I believe it's raining in West Tennessee, um, that means that I think that the proposition it is raining in West Tennessee is true, right? And so to get a little bit more precise about what thinking is here, thinking is basically holding a proposition with a certain degree of confidence that it's true, right? You believe a proposition only if you're relatively or very confident that the proposition is actually true. Okay. Okay, so this is the definition of belief that we will be working with for the rest of the course. We can distinguish this from like belief in a religious sense, right? So we might say that to believe P is a synonym for faith that P, right? So we might say that, oh, I believe in God, right? That's in the sense that, I don't know, right? But I think that the proposition is true on the basis of faith alone, right? This is not what we're talking about. So when we say that we believe that P is true, we're making a claim that thinking that a proposition is true or confidently endorsing the proposition as true, right? That's what we're working with. Okay. Okay, so we have belief on the table, and there seems to be a relationship between belief and truth. Okay, and we saw a little bit about there's a connection between belief and knowledge. So here's an argument that says that we have to have an understanding of truth in order to have an understanding of knowledge, right? Or that understanding truth is important for understanding what knowledge is. And given that knowledge is going to be the topic of the rest of our course, it's really important we kind of get clear on what truth is. Okay, so premise one. Belief is, as we've just said, thinking that a proposition is true or endorsing confidently that a proposition is true, right? Premise two. But all agree belief in the sense stated in one, right? In the first sense of belief, is a component to the definition of knowledge, is a component part of the definition of knowledge. So the idea here is that, okay, so whatever knowledge is, we can argue about what knowledge is, but whatever it is, it's got to have belief wrapped up in the definition. That's the idea here. So look, there's wide consensus that says that in order to know something, one of the necessary conditions you must meet is that you believe that that thing is true. Okay. So in order to understand a definition, one needs to understand the component parts of that definition. This is a relatively simple principle about understanding, right? And understanding and definitions, right? So if a definition has three conditions, you need to understand each of the conditions. So given that knowledge is one of the, given that belief is one of the conditions of knowledge, you need to understand what belief is. Okay, so therefore, if we are to understand our definition of knowledge, we need to understand truth. Well, why is this? How does that follow? Well, it follows because belief is thinking that a proposition is true, right? And so truth is a component of belief, right? Okay, and given that beliefs are a component of knowledge, it also follows that truth is also a component of knowledge. So, premise five, truth is itself a component part of knowledge, right? So all agree that truth belongs in the definition of knowledge. So therefore, if we are to understand the definition of knowledge, we also need to understand truth. Okay, so this is an argument that is intended to suggest that knowledge requires that we think about what truth is. Okay. And so we can, the question, what is truth, right? Pontius Pilate's question is a controversial one, right? And we get lots of different answers from lots of different philosophers all across time. So we can distinguish between three theories of truth. The first one is the correspondence theory of truth. This one's pretty popular. The idea here is that, look, something is true only if and only if, so we're talking about necessary and sufficient conditions, P is consistent with reality, right? So if the proposition God exists is true, then that means that God exists is consistent with reality, right? Um, if the proposition, it is raining outside in West Tennessee, is true, that means that that proposition is consistent with reality, right? So the idea is that propositions map on to reality such that reality makes them true or false, right? So if we think about we just go with me on this. If we think about a proposition as a light bulb, right? Say whenever it flashes, whenever it's true, right? And then when it's not true, it stops flashing. Okay, so we might say later on in the course we're going to be talking about a sheep in a field, right? And we might say that, okay, there's a sheep in that field. The proposition is true if and only if there is an actual sheep in the field, right? So if we can imagine if the sheep is meandering in and out of the field, that makes the proposition, the sheep is in the field, be true, and then go false, and then be true again, and then go false, and then be true again, and then it's false again. This is how the correspondence theory of truth works. There's a connection between reality as it is, right? Kind of full stop, and propositions, such that reality makes propositions true. Okay, so we might say that we might look at an argument. So why, you might be thinking, why should I buy into the correspondence theory of truth? Okay, so consider this argument. Unless we know, premise one, unless we know some unsolvable serious problem with a common sense theory of P, we should accept a theory of P that is in accord with common sense. Okay, so suppose we have a theory, like the correspondence theory of truth. If our theory is consistent with common sense experiences, right? The way that reality works, or the way that reality tends to work to us, then we should accept that theory, the one that's very simple and the one that is consistent with our common experience, our common sense experiences. Okay? So, unless we know of some unsolvable, serious problem with a common sense theory of truth, we should accept a theory of truth that is in accord with common sense, right? And so, okay, so we have an assumption, premise one, and then premise two is applying that assumption to our theory of truth. Premise three, in contrast to competing theories of truth, the correspondence theory of truth is consistent with our common sense thinking about the truth. So the idea here is that, look, when we think about true and false and stuff, just like in everyday thought, like we think that those claims just like match up with reality, right? So suppose I say, look, there's a squirrel in my yard. Somebody looks around and says, look, there's no squirrel out here. What you're saying isn't true, right? And then I say, no, wait, no, really, there is a squirrel in the yard. And I say something like, well, look, it's true because I said it's true. We might say that that's really counterintuitive. Rather, it seems like the correspondence theory of truth matches our intuitions about the way that the truth works. Okay, So premise 4 says that we know of no unsolvable serious problems with the correspondence theory of truth. Okay, and that means we should accept the correspondence theory of truth given its consistency with our common sense experiences. Okay, so this might be a good argument. This might be like a really terrible argument, right? But it is an argument in favor of the correspondence theory of truth. The essential idea here is that the way we talk and think about truth and falsehood, we need a theory that's consistent with kind of our everyday language, right? Okay, so consider consider a problem with this argument. So this is an argument for geocentrism that shares the exact same form as the last argument. So what is geocentrism? Geocentrism is the view that the Earth is the center of the solar system, right? So the way that that space works, right, and the way that our solar system works is that all of the planets and the sun go around the Earth, and the Earth stays still, right? We know by science that the Earth goes around the sun, right? But go with me on this, right? Okay, so premise 1 is the exact same as the last argument. So the idea is that unless we know of some unsolvable serious problem with common sense theory of P, we should accept a theory of P that is in accord with common sense. Okay? So if we want to explain P, we need a theory that is consistent with the way in which we think about P naturally. So unless we know of some unsolvable serious problem with a common sense theory of the relation between the sun and the earth, we should accept a common sense theory of the relation between the sun and the earth, right? Okay, so in contrast to competing theories of the relation between the sun and the earth, geocentrism is consistent with our common sense. Okay, so you and I were standing outside, we're looking up, and we see the sun is like moving, right? It goes, it takes a whole day, it goes, and we say, well, it looks like the sun is moving, and it doesn't feel like we're moving, right? And so if the sun is moving and we're not moving, that must mean that the sun is like going around the earth, right? Okay, and that seems pretty common sense. So premise 4 is we know of no unsolvable serious problems with geocentrism, and therefore we should accept geocentrism. Okay, so so it looks like if we endorse the last argument in favor of the correspondence theory of truth, it looks like we also might be stuck with this weird argument for geocentrism, which is highly implausible. Okay. One way in which somebody who is in favor of the last argument for the correspondence theory of truth it could respond is to reject premise 4. We in fact do know of horrible problems with the geocentric model of the universe, right? Namely, it's inconsistent with like all of this data from astronomy, right? And given all that data, we can safely reject geocentrism, right? So this argument isn't saying that we have to adopt the intuitive common sense theory, but that we should adopt the common sense theory unless we have some evidence that suggests that it's false. And in this case, we have evidence that suggests that geocentrism is false. So in contrast to the last slide, we know of no unsolvable serious problem with the correspondence theory of truth. We might say we have to look at philosophy articles, right? Maybe there are serious problems with the correspondence theory of truth, in which case this argument doesn't work because there are serious problems with the correspondence theory of truth. Okay. All right, so here is an argument against the correspondence theory of truth. Okay, You gotta get weird with me here because this is a weird argument. Okay, so there is no way for us to get outside of ourselves and check whether our ideas correspond with reality. Okay, so presumably the way that the world looks is it will look different than the way in which the world appears to us, right? So think about somebody that has color blindness for a moment. That person is going to see colors that non-colorblind people see, but see them slightly differently, or in some cases, not see any color at all. So for that person, uh, it would be it it would be false that something is red, right? Or at least it would appear to them to be false if something, whether or not something is red, right? Um, if they have like black and white color blindness, right? So we might say, well, look, we have these people who say they see red, right? The vast majority of people say they see red. Um, but it seems like there are these other people who say they see another color, right? And it's because like their cones in their eyes change the pigmentation such that they see different colors. So we might say, well, we need to figure out what the real color is. So if we can just like get outside of our own visual capacities to see the thing as objectively as we can and get the real color, then we'll know for sure what color the thing is, right? Premise one is saying we can't do that. It's saying that there's no way for us to kind of get out from behind our visual capacities or any of our perceptual capacities to see whether or not the propositions we believe match up with reality, right? Okay. If there's no way for us to get outside of ourselves and check whether or not our ideas or our beliefs correspond with reality, then given the correspondence theory, we cannot know what we believe is true. Okay, so the idea here is that, look, propositions are true if and only if they correspond with reality. Okay. In order to know whether or not our propositions and our beliefs correspond with reality, right? We have to get outside of ourselves in order to verify that reality works that way. But given that we can't get outside of ourselves to make sure reality works that way, we can't know whether what we believe is true because we can't know whether or not what we believe corresponds with reality in the right kind of way, right? So therefore, premise three, so conclusion from one and two, if the correspondence theory of truth is correct, then we can't know whether what we believe is true, right? We can't know whether we have true beliefs or false beliefs. But premise four is an assumption, but we can know whether what we believe is true, right? That seems highly intuitive. So therefore, the correspondence theory of truth is not correct. Okay? So correspondence theory implies that we can't know whether or not things are true. But in reality, actually, we can know that things are true. This is an assumption, right? A seeming. Uh, and so it follows that the correspondence theory of truth is not right. Okay. This is an argument against the correspondence theory of truth. Now, I actually favor the correspondence theory of truth, right? And a lot of philosophers do. So we might wonder whether or not we can respond to this argument and how we can respond to this argument. So one thing we might say is that do we need to get outside of ourselves and check whether or not our ideas correspond with reality, right? Maybe that's too high of a requirement for knowing whether or not something is true or false, right? Um, maybe that's only the requirement if like we're in the matrix or something, but more than likely we're not in the matrix. So maybe we can just see whether or not it's raining and then know that the reality is such that it is raining at the moment. So there and so in virtue of doing that, we would potentially reject premise two. um, so we could know even though we can't get outside of ourselves, like I talked about earlier. So, one helpful thing to do, and that you might have the option to do in a paper, is to look at this argument in a lot of detail and see how you might respond to this argument in defense of the correspondence theory of truth. Okay. So we have next the pragmatic theory of truth. So I have friends who endorse this view of truth. And I got to say, it's very odd. If you find yourself sympathetic to it, that's a-okay. But I think it's very, very odd and highly counterintuitive. So a proposition or a belief is true if and only if, right? So we're talking about a necessary and sufficient condition, right? So if and only if. So if signals a sufficient condition, while only if signals a necessary condition. If and only if believing or holding that P is cognitively useful and renders useful or functional actions, right? Okay. So things are true or things are false only insofar as they're useful for me instrumentally. That means they're only true insofar as they are useful for me functioning in everyday life, right? So let's imagine that I'm about to cross the street and cars are like zipping by, and I say, well, you know, it could be that we're like in a simulation and that there's not all these cars here, and it could be that like I'm dreaming, maybe I'm at my house like sleeping and I'm dreaming that I'm like about to cross the street, and I mean, we might entertain all these weird possibilities. Okay, but the pragmatist, he's going to say, no, look, it's useful for you to believe that those cars are real, right? Because if you walk out into the street, you're going to get hit and it's going to hurt real bad. It's probably going to kill you. And so it's useful for us to believe that the traffic is like whipping by, right? And given that it's useful to us, that makes it true that the traffic is like zipping by, right? Okay, so work with me on this. Um, so things are true insofar or in virtue of whether or not they're useful for humans, right? So it's not the traffic zipping by is not true because the traffic is actually zipping by, right? So we're talking about the proposition, the traffic is zipping by, right? Or there's traffic. There's traffic is not true because of the traffic that's going, right? But there's traffic is true only insofar as it keeps me safe, right? It's useful for me, and that's what makes it true. Okay. So it's all about utility, right? This is not a utilitarian position per se, but it is a position that says that things are only true and only false if they have some kind, they're useful or non-useful. Okay, so we might think like that seems weird. Let's entertain a couple of criticisms. So Creel protests this view. So if the pragmatist theory of truth is correct, then there can be no cognitively useful beliefs that are false. Okay, so This means that all beliefs that are useful are true. That means that is, uh, uh, if a belief is useful, then that belief is true. So all useful beliefs are all true beliefs. Premise two, but there are cognitively useful beliefs that are false. For example, in the case of the placebo effect, Sam's false belief that there is medicine in the pill is pragmatically useful, since let us suppose it helps Sam get better. Okay, so Sam takes the pill and then starts to feel better, right? And because he believes that that was a pill that worked, right? That belief is useful for helping him get better. But in reality, it's just like a sugar pill, right? It doesn't actually do anything. So so it looks like, if this case is right, then it looks like you can have a belief that's useful, and it can be distinct from a belief that's true, right? Or you can have a belief that's useful and false. There's another example here. To take a different kind of example, it is useful to John to falsely believe in the tooth fairy, since believing there is a tooth fairy helps him cope with the rest of his shitty life. We might say that John is a person that's very miserable and very depressed, but believing that there's a tooth fairy just helps him get by, right? We might say that, look, just because that belief is useful to John does not make it such that there is a tooth fairy. That seems very clear to me. So it follows that the pragmatist theory of truth is incorrect. And we showed that by modus tollens. So we started with a conditional, we denied the consequent, and then we could deny the antecedent, which is the conclusion. So you might also think maybe you want to defend the pragmatist theory of truth. Helpful exercise might be, how can we respond to this argument, right? Can we draw a distinction somewhere? Can we say, is a pragmatist theory of truth like potentially okay with the falsehood of some propositions that seem to be useful, or maybe the usefulness of a proposition has to be for like a whole collection of people and not just one person? There might be different ways we could respond to this argument. Okay. Lastly, we have the coherence theory of truth. So a proposition or a belief is true if and only if P coheres with other propositions that someone believes. Okay. So once again, we're thinking about an if and only if statement. So we're identifying a necessary and sufficient condition. So to see the necessary condition that P coheres with other propositions, right? If a proposition is true, then necessary condition, P coheres with other propositions, right? Okay. Lastly, we see the sufficient condition. So if a proposition P coheres with other propositions, then this is sufficient. Oh, whoops. This is sufficient for P's being true. Okay. So the idea here is that, look, you hold all sorts of beliefs, right? What day it is, what your birthday is, whether or not you've been to the moon, whether or not you've been to the Grand Canyon, whether or not you've been outside, right? These are all beliefs that you hold true. Okay. So what if what is true is just merely a matter of making it fit in with all of your other beliefs, right? So the idea here is something like, if somebody tells you something And that thing is just so crazy, just so wild and far-fetched. We might say that according to the coherence theory of truth, it doesn't cohere or mesh with the rest of your beliefs, right? Or the rest of the propositions that you endorse as true. And that, in virtue of that, your belief is false. That's kind of the idea here. So uh, you believe all the things that you believe, and I say something like, look, there are these intergalactic aliens and they're walking all among us, and people that you know are probably an alien. I've seen them. I'm one too, right? And I might say, look, I'm making a bunch of different claims, but given that those claims don't mesh well with the rest of what you believe, those claims are false. Now, if you're like super weird like me and you believe everything that I believe, right, then that would make all those things true, right? So what's true is dependent upon the rest of what you believe. Okay, and so we might say like, is truth really a function of coherence, right? So um, um, consider an argument, right? So snakes are wolves, right? Okay. Wolves are mammals. Okay. That means that snakes are mammals, right? So this is a syllogism in an argument with a false premise. But let's just suppose that I believe that snakes are wolves, and that fits in with the rest of what I believe. And I also believe that wolves are mammals too. That means that the conclusion is also true, that snakes are mammals. Um, so if we endorse the coherence theory of truth, can we ever say that any of these propositions are actually false, or like absolutely false according to coherence theory? No, because it just depends on what some individual person believes, right? And so when you have a person with like all of these wacky and weird ass beliefs, um, they're gonna like, different beliefs are gonna fit right in, beliefs that are just like clearly false, or would be false to a vast majority of people, right? So this looks like a problem with the coherence theory of truth. Now you might think, um, maybe we can save this theory of truth, right? Maybe we can respond to this, right? We're not going to do that today, because I want you to think that the correspondence theory is right. But yeah, so a good paper might defend the coherence theory against this objection, right? So anyway, this is the end of the lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it.